I wasn't the kind of employee who made noise. I didn't network loudly or compete for visibility. I had spent over a decade cultivating relationships the slow way, one meeting, one follow up, one remembered detail at a time. And in the world of high net worth client service, that mattered. People don't trust flashy, they trust consistency. That was my edge. My clients weren't assigned to me, they stayed with me. Not because I sold them something, but because I knew how to protect what they valued. When the quarterly numbers went up, my name was rarely attached, but those numbers were built on the calls I returned at midnight, the red flags I saw before they became losses, and the quiet confidence I gave to clients who never needed to question whether I was paying attention. But then came the reorg. A new department head, Jason, young, articulate, eager to innovate. He didn't ask about how things worked. He came in with answers. Said the department was too legacy driven, that we needed to streamline, modernize, evolve. I listened. I had seen this kind of energy before. I knew it usually came before something broke. Still, I stayed quiet, let him speak, until I saw the first reshuffling chart and my name wasn't on it, at least not in the place it had always been. I was moved to operational experience liaison, no client facing duties, no strategy, no team. When I asked for clarification, I was told it was a temporary restructure to support cross functional innovation. But the message was clear: I had been removed. Quietly, formally, with just enough layers of corporate politeness to suggest it wasn't personal. But it was. Jason wanted a louder team, people who matched his energy, his style, his metrics. He didn't want careful relationship management. He wanted velocity, and I didn't fit. My clients weren't notified, they were simply reassigned. One of them emailed me a week later asking why a junior associate had taken over their portfolio. I forwarded the message to Jason. He never replied. Instead, I was moved, literally, to a small room at the back of the office, stripped of natural light, tucked between a file storage closet and the server room. No one called it a demotion. No one needed to. The message had already been delivered. The room they moved me into wasn't meant for anyone to stay in long. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The air conditioning didn't quite reach it. There were no visitors, no footsteps outside my door, no reason for anyone to wander back there unless they were lost. And yet, I showed up every day on time, dressed as if I still had client meetings, and carried myself with the same care I always had. If they were waiting for me to wither, they were going to wait a while. My new role was vague: supporting operations and process feedback, which meant I was handed leftover tasks, backlog tickets, and outdated templates to clean up. No strategy, no forward motion, just digital housekeeping. But I completed every task, not with resentment, with accuracy, because what they didn't understand is that removing someone from visibility doesn't remove their value. It just moves it somewhere quieter, and in that quiet, I started to observe. I watched how client response times shifted, how tone changed in outbound messages, how templated check-ins replaced meaningful follow-up. I wasn't spying, I wasn't bitter, I was simply listening to the difference between presence and substitution. And the difference was sharp. Clients who used to be stable began asking more questions. One requested multiple revisions to a report that I used to deliver in a single meeting. Another escalated a billing concern that could have been solved with one call, had they known who to call. The cracks weren't dramatic, they were small, slow, and inevitable. Because you can't replace a relationship with a workflow, but Jason didn't see it. He was too busy presenting operational efficiencies to senior leadership, showing them charts of reduced meeting times and increased automation. He interpreted silence from clients as satisfaction. He assumed that absence of conflict meant alignment, but silence only ever means one of two things: trust or distance. And in this case, it was the latter. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't volunteer solutions. They had already decided I wasn't part of the future, so I let them move toward it, without the foundation they thought they no longer needed. I wasn't angry. I was steady. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't. When relationships fracture, the people who remember what mattered don't go to war. They wait, and sometimes they come looking. I didn't walk out when they moved me to the back room. I walked in, every day, without protest. Not because I lacked ambition, not because I had accepted their verdict, but because I understood something they didn't. Endurance is not silence. It's strategy. They thought I had been displaced. What they didn't realize is that they had given me exactly what they were so desperate to control: distance. And with distance comes perspective. I began to notice things I couldn't see when I was in motion. I watched how the team began to fracture, softly, then obviously. The new hires, promoted quickly for their assertiveness, struggled with the nuance of long-standing relationships. Emails became more templated, less thoughtful. Follow-ups were missed. Tiny mistakes began to accumulate. A misspelled name on a birthday gift, a document delivered in the wrong file format, a deadline that had never been confirmed but always understood, until now. I didn't correct them. That wasn't my place anymore. And truthfully, I wasn't interested in patching holes they refused to see. Instead, I paid attention. Every fumbled exchange told a story, not of incompetence, but of assumption. They assumed relationships were interchangeable, that clients valued polish over presence, that a CRM update could replace years of earned trust. In that silence, I started writing. Not a report, a record. For myself, for clarity. I noted each missed touchpoint, each client who used to call on Fridays but now hadn't contacted the office in 3 weeks. Each time a client name appeared in an internal email without a real understanding of who that person actually was. Because in our line of work, clients don't leave all at once. They leave slowly, quietly, one unmet need at a time, one disappointment layered over another until loyalty becomes fatigue. I had once prevented that erosion before it ever started. Now I was watching it unfold from the very edges, and it was happening faster than anyone seemed willing to admit. Occasionally, younger staff came to me in private. A question here, a hunch there. Did Client X always send approvals through their assistant? Was there a reason we used to hold off on scheduling reviews in early March? They were starting to feel the disconnect, even if they couldn't name it. I answered always, without emotion, without agenda. Not because I wanted to be reinstated, but because they were asking the right questions. And in a workplace that had trained itself to value speed over care, the return of thoughtful questions was the first sign of awakening. I didn't speak up in meetings, I wasn't invited to many, but I began to understand something I hadn't seen before. Influence doesn't vanish when your title does. It just moves. Beneath the radar, into memory, into contrast, and sometimes into the hands of the very people who are learning. Slowly, painfully, what happens when you build systems without soul? I didn't speak to justify myself. I let the space they gave me speak for itself. In that small, windowless room, I found what they had lost in their rush to modernize: perspective. They had built a system that chased visibility but ignored vision, that applauded movement but feared stillness. And so I stayed still, not passive, aware. I began mapping the changes not just in what was happening, but in how people were responding. At first, it was defensiveness. When a client sent a second follow-up, junior staff scrambled, hoping urgency would mask oversight. But urgency without depth is noise. And clients can tell the difference. I saw panic dressed up as enthusiasm. Energy used to cover up the fact that no one really knew how the client liked to work, or why certain routines had once been non-negotiable. I remembered, but I said nothing. The mistake they made wasn't just in removing me, it was in believing they could replace what I carried without even understanding what it was. My relationships weren't stored in CRM tags or timeline decks. They were stored in a dozen small instincts. When to wait before calling back, what not to say during a stressful quarter, which assistant to loop in if a client stopped replying. These weren't skills. They were presence. And they had never been trained into the people now holding my accounts. Still, I remained invisible. Not irrelevant, just unacknowledged. Until something began to shift. Clients started asking questions that didn't reach me directly but passed through whispers. Was Camille reassigned? Is she on leave? One of them, a long-term client I had worked with for 7 years, reportedly told Jason during a quarterly check-in, "The service is professional, but it's not human anymore." I heard about it third hand. I didn't respond because there was nothing to clarify. They already knew. A few weeks later, a new process memo went out from leadership. The language was neutral, but I recognized the subtext: reinforce personalized engagement at every stage of client experience. It was an attempt to patch what they couldn't articulate: the absence of relationship memory. I didn't laugh. I didn't roll my eyes. Because watching someone finally realize what they lost isn't satisfying, it's sobering. I updated my private record. The tone had changed. Not publicly, not yet. But internally, there was hesitation, a sense that something wasn't working, that maybe the system hadn't evolved, maybe it had emptied. I didn't step forward. I didn't ask to be consulted because the thing they had failed to recognize was now beginning to surface without my help. The system was calling itself into question, and all I had done was give it time. The shift didn't come with a crash, it came with a visit. A Thursday morning, unremarkable in every other way, until the receptionist walked into the back area, where no one ever came, and said, "Camille, there's someone asking for you at the front." I assumed it was a delivery, maybe a vendor who remembered me from the old days. But when I stepped into the lobby, it was a client, one of mine. A long-standing, private, soft-spoken man who had been with the firm longer than most employees had. He looked me in the eye and said, "I was in the area. I stopped by because I realized I haven't heard your voice in months." And I noticed the difference. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That sentence alone shifted something. I invited him into one of the glass meeting rooms, the ones I hadn't stepped into since the restructure, and we talked. Not about numbers, not about reports, about how things had felt lately. The tone, the pace, the subtle, persistent sense that he was no longer being cared for, just managed. He said he had tried to go along with it, tried to assume it was just a phase. But then he stopped getting proactive updates. His preferences weren't remembered. The questions became more transactional. And finally, he said, "I asked where you were." No one had a real answer. I listened, carefully. I didn't apologize for decisions that weren't mine. I didn't speak poorly of the new team. I just listened. And then I said something simple. I never stopped caring. I just stopped being allowed to show it. He nodded. And then, with the same calm he had always carried, he said, "Would you be willing to step in again if I requested it?" I didn't answer immediately because I knew the weight of that question. It wasn't just about him. It was about what it would trigger. And I was right. By the end of the day, leadership had heard. Jason sent a short message. "Let's connect about client R's visit." But there was no follow-up meeting. Just tension, just silence. And then, over the next week, 2 more clients, both legacy accounts, reached out with similar questions. "Is Camille still with the firm? Why was she reassigned?" No one knew how to answer. Because the truth was, I was still there. They had simply forgotten why that mattered. After that visit, things began to slip. Not in one moment, not with an announcement, but in pieces. Small pieces that leadership couldn't quite connect because they had spent too long ignoring the center. The client who came looking for me didn't escalate. He didn't threaten to leave. He simply insisted, gently but firmly, that all future communication go through me. When Jason tried to redirect, the client responded with 3 words. "I'll wait then." And he did. His account went quiet, not out of neglect, but out of resistance. He had drawn a line, and others started to notice. Another client, one who had recently transitioned to a newer associate, asked to revise the communication cadence. When asked why, she said, "It used to feel intuitive. Now it just feels busy." The words weren't dramatic, but they cut deeper than criticism, because they pointed to something the company had never measured: care. And care was what had gone missing the moment they decided I was too traditional, too relationship-driven, too quiet for the future. I saw panic begin to take root. Not in the open, but behind closed doors. Meetings became more frequent, more urgent. Jason began sitting in on calls he once delegated freely. Feedback cycles shortened. Reporting templates changed, but none of it addressed the core issue. They weren't losing clients because of deliverables. They were losing them because clients no longer felt known. And when clients stop feeling known, they stop trusting. And when trust slips, no policy can fix it. My name started to circulate again, not in memos, but in sentences that began with, "Maybe Camille would know." I was asked to join one client call, then another, always framed as support, never lead. But I didn't care about the semantics. I saw what was happening. I wasn't being brought back into power. I was being pulled into stability. And the difference mattered, because power can be revoked. But trust returns only when it's remembered. One afternoon, I received an email from a client I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. It had only one line. "Still at the firm?" I wrote back with one word. "Yes." The reply came within minutes. "Good, let's talk." No one in leadership saw that message. No one needed to. Because by then, what was unraveling was no longer a question of structure. It was a question of memory. And the people who remembered me were beginning to remember what the company used to feel like before it tried to reinvent itself without the people who made it work. The collapse didn't come from a scandal. It came from a silence that leadership could no longer control. The kind of silence that doesn't happen because people stop caring, but because they've already given up on being heard. Inside the office, tension settled into the halls like static. People spoke softer, moved faster, and avoided eye contact just a little longer than usual. There were whispers of client dissatisfaction, but no one addressed them directly. Instead, there were meetings, layers of them. Jason held biweekly alignment syncs that had more slides than strategy, more talking than listening. Each time, the team left less sure of what they were supposed to be fixing. Because no one wanted to name the real problem, that the clients who mattered most had begun to emotionally check out. And when high-value clients disengage emotionally, financial loss is not far behind. But Jason still didn't see it. He was busy fine-tuning onboarding flows and streamlining response templates, trying to modernize what was never broken. Meanwhile, the people actually interacting with clients began to lose confidence. They started copying me on emails again, asking for clarity on things I hadn't touched in a year. How did we used to structure this summary? What tone do we normally take with this client? The questions came with a nervous edge, like they were trying to stitch something together without admitting it had unraveled, and I answered every one. Not for recognition, for the clients, because someone still needed to be reliable. When the first termination notice came from a major account, quiet, professional, definitive, Jason framed it as a strategic phase-out. But those of us who had worked on that account before knew the truth. That client had never left a partnership once they felt seen. We had made them feel that way before the structure changed. Two more followed, not with drama, with distance. They stopped replying, stopped requesting meetings, then stopped renewing. And suddenly, Jason was no longer so loud. The slide decks disappeared, the meetings shortened. He stopped asking for optimism, he started asking for facts. And the facts were these: retention had dropped. Revenue was unstable, and the clients weren't just leaving, they were leaving quietly, which is always worse. Because when clients go without noise, there's no fire to put out, just ashes, just absence. And now even the board was noticing the smoke that wasn't there, but should have been. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't signal peace, it signals retreat. That's what the office became. Quiet but brittle, polite but strained. People showed up, nodded through meetings, answered emails with clockwork rhythm. But no one believed in the future we were pretending to build. I watched as Jason, once so assured, so proud of his model, began to falter under the weight of what he'd ignored. His calendar, once impossible to access, suddenly had open blocks. His tone, once sharp with confidence, began to soften into uncertainty. He still tried to frame the unraveling as transition. He spoke of learning curves and adjustments to client expectation. But we all knew what it really was: consequence. The clients we lost weren't lost to competitors, they were lost to neglect, to the slow erosion of trust that happens when people are treated like transactions. And the numbers were no longer easy to spin. Finance reports began showing retention rates that couldn't be explained away. Leadership asked for analysis. Jason produced charts, but charts don't answer questions clients won't ask anymore. And in that vacuum, the board acted, not publicly, not immediately, but definitively. Within 3 weeks, Jason was removed. The internal announcement cited a shift in strategic direction. No mention of failure, just finality. His office was cleared before Monday. The seat he once held in every meeting stayed empty for a week. Then a quiet appointment was made. Interim leadership, tasked with reassessing the firm's core values and long-term positioning. That phrase stuck with me, core values, because I remembered when that had meant something. Before vision was mistaken for volume, before presence was sacrificed for pace, before I was moved to the back room. In the days that followed, people began to approach me differently, less urgently, more honestly. A junior manager asked if I'd be willing to review some of the legacy processes again. Another admitted they had never fully understood why certain clients trusted me more than anyone else. I didn't respond with judgment, just quiet clarity, because this wasn't a moment for vindication, it was a moment for restoration. The firm hadn't failed because of one man. It had failed because it had forgotten what mattered and who held it together when no one was watching. And now, piece by piece, they were remembering, not because I reminded them, but because the cost of forgetting had finally arrived. And it had emptied more than just a pipeline. It had emptied the room of its confidence. And now they were looking for someone who had never asked to be followed, but had always been trusted. They didn't offer me an apology. They offered me a desk, a real one this time, with windows, a nameplate, and the kind of view they used to reserve for people who were louder than I ever chose to be. The interim leadership asked if I would step in to help stabilize client experience. But we both knew what they meant. They needed me to fix what had unraveled, not because I asked for the responsibility, but because I was the only one who had stayed steady through the collapse. I accepted the role not out of pride, but out of care. Not for the firm as it was, but for the clients it had neglected and the people inside who still wanted to do the work right. I wasn't interested in reclaiming my old title. I wanted to rebuild the part of the company that had once meant something real. My first move wasn't to rewrite processes or overhaul the team. I started with listening, quietly, consistently, and with full attention. I met with staff who had been afraid to speak under the previous regime. I asked about what was working, not what looked good, but what felt solid. I asked where people had lost trust, where they had stopped believing they were making a difference. The answers weren't loud. They were long, considered, sometimes hesitant, but they were honest. And in that honesty, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: hope. Not the kind that comes from a new title or another memo, the kind that shows up when people realize they're finally being heard. Clients noticed, too. Slowly, I reconnected with the ones who had left without noise. Some had already moved on, but a few were still listening, waiting to see what came next. One of them, the very same who had walked in and asked for me by name, sent a message. Glad to see they've remembered what mattered. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. That was the legacy I was rebuilding. Not just a client list, not just a department, but a culture. One where presence mattered more than posturing. One where care wasn't a slogan, it was the foundation. And the team, once fragmented, began to align again, not around hierarchy, around trust. I didn't take back what had been mine. I built something better in its place. Leadership asked if I wanted to return to my former title, but I declined. Titles hadn't protected me before, and they wouldn't define me now. Instead, I asked for something else: permanence of principle. I proposed a new standard, one that would be applied across every client-facing role: relational continuity. Not just performance metrics, not just quarterly feedback, but the ability to hold memory, tone, presence. It wasn't revolutionary, it was foundational. And somehow it felt like a new idea in a place that had once known better. I trained the new team not with scripts, but with context. I showed them how to notice the unspoken. When a client pauses just before agreeing, when a name is mentioned too casually, when an email feels too efficient. I taught them how to feel the weight behind words. Because care isn't something you perform, it's something you practice. And slowly, it took root. Clients began to trust again, not just me, but the system. Because they could feel it, that someone had restored the quiet scaffolding that makes trust possible. And internally, something else happened. Something I hadn't expected. Staff started to stay. The turnover that once emptied entire departments began to slow. People who had once kept their ideas to themselves now spoke up, not to impress, but to improve. I didn't lead from the front of the room. I led from wherever I was needed. And that, more than any strategy or restructure, was what changed the culture. The company didn't rebound overnight, but it recentered. And in that quiet recentering, my name was never written into a plaque or painted on a wall, but it didn't need to be. Because the clients knew, the staff knew, and I knew. The woman they moved to the backroom had become the foundation they didn't know they'd erased until one client came looking. And now everything we build carries the trace of that moment. Not as revenge, not as victory, but as memory. The kind that endures.